The Viking Super Stol program has been going on for a few years. Basically, the Super Stol, as you know, is the meanest and the toughest of all the short takeoff and landing aircraft in the experimental category. Now, so obviously Viking wants to be part of that. We want to show that our engine is equally good as any other engine and so forth and so on. Now, we started this in 2017, early 2017, and we had a Super Stol flying. We flew it to Oshkosh. We flew it all over the country on the east side, and we truly enjoyed it. Now, analyzing that project, we found that there were some flaws. You know, basically we were kind of stuck with the short version of their airframe, and Just Aircraft, when they went with a bigger engine like the 180 Lycoming clone engine, they stretched the airplane, made it a little bit longer, and put bigger tail feathers on it, aerodynamically streamlined tail feathers, or with a little bit of lift back there, and there was a whole lot of little changes that went with going with the bigger engine. Unfortunately for Viking, we kind of ended up with a Rotex powered airplane style that we ended up putting 180 horsepower on. So even though it flew really well and we had a great time with it, and we did the Oshkosh run and showed off the airplane at Valhalla, North Carolina, with the Just Aircraft guys, and people were very impressed, we were not 100% satisfied with the development ourselves. And we ended up then redoing the installation with a nicer cowling that was not so obtrusive as far as forward visibility. We lowered the engine a few inches. We shortened the engine mount, brought the engine closer to the firewall, started with a lighter propeller. There was a whole host of minor tweaks that ended up making a huge difference in the way that the airplane then finally ended up looking and performing, and that's what we're now showing you here. Mostly the new stuff. YouTube will have some videos showing the earlier stuff. We're very happy with the final design. This is now 2019, and we're in February, so if the airplane will be at Sun and Fun or Oshkosh, we're not so sure. It's now being delivered to the rightful customer tomorrow, and he has scheduled some maintenance and some work on the airplane up at Just Aircraft again. But here's where we are with the aircraft now. These are the details of the installation. The firewall forward packages for this airplane now, with the huge amount of thrust that this engine provides, has been finalized. All the molds are done, the engine mounts are done, and it's now viable and probably the most powerful and most brute thrust airplane, Super Stol airplane that you can buy. So this is an option for those that want to go with this engine over the Rotax or the 180 Lycoming. All right, we've done a complete firewall forward package. We've had this for a few years on the Super Stol by Just Aircraft. Here's a little bit of details about this engine, how to install it. Basically, it's an installation video for those that are installing the 180 in the Super Stol or on a stretched Highlander or something like that. First off, this is a short airplane, which made us have to mount the engine as close to the firewall as possible. Now, in order to do that, being such a big engine for a little airplane, which would be less of an issue if it was a stretched airplane, but would still keep the short mount like this to get the weight aft. The engine mount, as you can see, is very tight. There's still room, to work on the engine. There's not much back there that you have to work on. But the engine mount bolts actually come from the inside of the airplane because of the triangulation or lack of triangulation. Now, in order for that to work properly, additional strength has been gained by tying the engine using eye bolts, as you can see here, that go right into the engine. and it then ties back to the strong truss that holds the landing gear. So now those are just for extra precaution, you can say, if you had a very, very hard landing or something, but they're there. And there's one on this side and also one on this side. The way you fabricate that is you get the 3/8 eyeballs, put them through when you mount the engine mount, and then make the wire rope, 1/8" wire rope with thimbles. You just make it a 1/4 inch short of it hitting the firewall, so when you tighten the nuts outside, it also tightens the cables behind the firewall. Here we're looking at heater installation. The heater from Viking, you just basically mount it with the tube sticking out through the firewall, then wire it up to a switch where you can have low or high heat, meaning 1 fan or 2 fans. So a center off switch with up and down, and then wire it in the way that you can do the dual fan or single fan. The hoses for the heater are up here on the side of the engine. Many ways of doing that depending on where you mount the heater. If the heater is on this side of the firewall, maybe vertically, then you can come down here along these tubes. We elected to keep the heater kind of vertically above the feet, and we ran the hoses through 90s around on the cold side of the engine, which means we didn't really have to worry about the heat from the turbocharger or anything for the coolant hoses. We also make the holes in the firewall big enough for the hoses so that when you push the hoses through the holes and onto the aluminum barbs that do stick out through the holes, the back side of the clamp, which of course there can't be any leaks there because it's behind the clamp, also function as the grommet. That part of the hose functions as the grommet to hold the hose in place. We've decided to use 1/4 inch hardware everywhere to mount the engine. In fact, on this prototype we did earlier, we drilled out to 5/16, but 1/4 inch is what the engine mounts are set up for, and that will be the standard. It's important to ground the engine properly. So I'll show you the 2 grounding cables. There's one here, which is grounded properly to the engine block and then strain relieved, and then from there the cable leaves the vibrating engine, is then tied to the engine mount so that vibration is isolated away from the final terminal, which goes in the left and also right engine mount location. Okay, so then you have dual heavy number 6 wire or cable grounding. This one is then tied a couple of places on the engine, then tied to the engine mount a couple of places, and then makes its way here. The coolant overflow, you would install that by running a hose from your 5-pound cap, radiator cap. It's a little bit of pressure. With such a low pressure, you use the Evans NPG coolant, no regular coolant, because that would then boil at that low pressure. And then you mount your coolant bottle below, somewhere on the firewall below the fill cap, so that anything that comes out would then go through a hose and then down to the bottle, and that becomes your level. So you would purge the engine by running it for a while with this cap open or loose, and then refill it a few times, and then eventually close it and monitor that the engine's going up to operating temperature by checking the radiator on each side, or these hoses or tubes, that they're getting warm equally. As far as hooking up the radiator, Super Duty has a crosswise radiator underneath the cowling. You're going to mount it to extra long and lower mounting bolts for the radiator. It's double nutted, meaning that there's a nut here which then torques the engine mount into place against the steel sleeve that's inside the rubbers. And we also spaced it a little bit in order to get the radiator back where we wanted it. And then we added another nut through the centrally welded bracket on top of the radiator, and we left that just slightly loose so that the whole radiator then can move just a little bit. If this was tight, then there would be a bending moment on the tab. Leaving it a little bit loose allows for the radiator to have a long life. We also fabricated a standoff out of a piece of 3/8 solid aluminum rod with a plate that just was screwed to the radiator down here. And it goes back, and we found a location where we could drill for a small AM3 bolt and attach it to the front landing gear truss. Now, as far as the plumbing of the radiator, you have your thermostat in this housing here. There are different angles on thermostat housing, so if you don't have the one that comes down this way, maybe contact Viking and we can help you with that. Or even if it comes out towards us, you could use 45-degree silicone elbow. We elected to do it this way, which means the hot water, or hot coolant, comes out of the cylinder head here and then makes it down to this side of the radiator and then flows across the radiator to the other side. And a 90-degree silicone hose with a pipe running back across behind the engine brings the fluid back to the engine through this other hose and then through the thermostat when it is open. Once it gets through the thermostat, then it goes through this tube behind the exhaust of the turbocharger and into the water pump and pumps through the engine. The gearbox on the turbo engine is a very heavy-duty unit. It has extra bearings. It can take somewhat of a prop extension, no problem. And we have done that on this installation to get through the cowling. Your temperature probe for the gearbox is up here. Your temperature probe for coolant is right here. That's the one that goes to the Viking view. Your oil pressure is on this side of the engine, and right here. Your oil filter is here. Your torsion damper assembly is up inside here. Your turbocharger is this we have in focus right now. Air enters through the air cleaner on the front, goes through this ducting, it goes down into the turbine part of the turbocharger, and then exits through this duct going over to the other side. These, of course, this is your intercooler kit that you get from Viking. The clamps have to be tight, the hoses have to be the right kind. Everything has to have a bead or a barb on it because there's lots of pressure in that system when you're running it from that point. Comes across to this side of the engine. You also want some connectors here and there for flexibility in the system. The intercooler is then mounted a couple of ways. Well, let's just go through the plumbing first. Air goes through the intercooler. Air then exits the intercooler and goes up to the throttle body, into the intake manifold, and then into the engine. This part is a throttle position sensor. It is critical for this engine to run properly. Don't take these screws off. There's a fine-tuned adjustment in here that was done using a laptop computer so that the throttle position sensor would read correctly and operate the controller for the turbo engine, which you see on this side. Rather than a vacuum bellow thing from the olden days, this is now a stepper motor that can accurately control boost as you're climbing to altitude. And this is based on the position of the throttle, hence the throttle position sensor. Hooking up your throttle is conventional through this clip. There's some adjustments. Make sure that groove goes into the cable. Use the right part number cable so everything fits. Behind here, make sure that you spend some time hooking up the clip properly with the side of the clip away from the plastic throttle position sensor housing so nothing can bind. You can bend the throttle lever arm slightly if you have to. Be very careful, and then rig it up so that you test it, and it can never bind on that or on the cable wiring that is attached going to the computer. Now, back to the intercooler. The intercooler is attached to the airframe using a plate, picking up basically some stainless rivets here in the existing welded on brackets from Just Aircraft. That puts like a 1 by 8 inch aluminum bracket going all the way down, or a piece of strapping. Then the intercooler itself has a piano hinge pop rivet to it. When you do that, put a drill stop when you drill those holes, because keep in mind, you can't put a hole in the actual intercooler if you drill through this first part. But if you hit this second part, you now have a hole in the actual intercooler. So make a drill stop so that your drill just breaks through here, and then pop rivet using stainless steel or hardened aluminum pop rivets and attach the hinge part to that. Then make this piece here, cut out for this, and screw this together, put a hinge pin in here, and that will set the intercooler at the proper height in relationship to clearing the cowling and clearing the bottom of the airplane. And you can see from this side that from the engine mount, it is pretty much going right through the center of this bottom tank on the intercooler. So, but that also you can see on the top that it has to have the right height in order for the top cowling to fit. The intercooler can then be removed by just pulling the hinge pin out if you need to. There's another mount for it back here. It's a large industrial Adel clamp that goes around the tube, and a bolt is 8 by 1.25 thread is threaded into an existing ear on the side of the intercooler. Let's look at the starter installation. The starter, of course, is on the engine when you receive it. The cable from the wire loom that Viking makes is already plugged in. You have to add 2 cables to this location, and they have to be strain relieved, as in tying it somewhere to the engine. We added a bolt to the case of the engine that we glue Loctite it in, and then we had something to tie the cables to so that there's no vibration that breaks these lugs right here. From there, one of these 2 cables just goes a very short distance to the alternator. Okay, so that just is basically just to bring the current from the alternator to the other cable, which then goes into the cockpit area where the batteries are mounted somewhere. In this airplane, the batteries are then mounted in the tail. There's actually a firewall pass-through. I don't know if we can film that, but there is a firewall pass-through back here that has the positive cable attached to it on the inside or the outside, and it also then has an equivalent cable coming from the back of the airplane, and it goes to the same lug on the inside here. And from there, we also picked up our wire that powers everything up front here in the airplane. Okay, so that cable on the left there, that's like a number 10, and it goes up to the main bus for the airplane for your lights and your heater and all that kind of stuff. So that powers the inside stuff other than the starter. Here you can see our grounding cable is coming up through the floor, and it is grounded through this bolt running through the middle mount here, and then that goes out to the sides as we showed before, and the ground is picked up in the corner bolts on the outside. The ECU that operates the engine is mounted up in this corner. Okay, electronic control unit. We usually just tie wrap it up in there just to kind of make it isolated from the airframe vibration. and then that's really all that's needed because it's super lightweight, and we just want it to be not rigidly bolted to anything. The cable in this particular installation just kind of runs along the firewall and then goes out to the engine through this firewall grommet. From there, the cable comes out and goes to the engine. It is strain relieved. As it leaves the engine, it's tied to something on the engine, and then it jumps the gap from there to the firewall. As far as your engine instrumentation, we looked at a couple of senders that were out here for your water temperature and your coolant temperature, and your oil pressure and gearbox temperature. The actual gauge for that is the Viking View, which is right here. For turbo engines, it is wired in a way where the Viking View, rather than have an RPM up here, which it normally does, we remove that, and you now have voltage there. It could also be programmed for like turbine inlet temperature or temperature after the intercooler, if you'd like that. But that's like a variable, because you do have voltage down here on this gauge, and also you have voltage here if the alternator ever failed, and also the new wire diagram shows a dual voltmeter to be installed. So it might be more useful to use that as turbine inlet temperature. In any case, this is showing the setup or the layout of a turbine or a turbocharged engine instrumentation package. You have RPM with a voltmeter built in. You have your boost gauge, which for this engine will be running half a bar of boost straight up there in cruise, and 0.75 bar for takeoff, which is controlled by throttle. And then over here you have all the other stuff. So that's your instrumentation package. Your propeller would mount obviously to the front with a spinner. There's various types of propellers available. Just follow the instructions from the manufacturer of the propeller. We also have videos that show how to install propellers and how to balance propellers. On your turbocharger here, you have a few noteworthy things, like for instance, here is your coolant line that comes in and cools your turbocharger, and coolant returned back to the system. Up on top here, there is a oil line going into the turbocharger. It starts down here actually, through this hard line right there. There's a little screen on the back side of that. Maybe on annual inspection, take a quick look at that, make sure that screen is not plugged. Likelihood of it being plugged, of course, is very, very slim. Oil comes from here, pipe pressure goes to the top here, cools and lubricates the bearing for the turbo, and then it's gravity fed back to the engine block through this larger hose that goes back to the oil tank. The turbocharger is unique in the sense that it runs at lower temperatures than traditional older style turbochargers. As you can see, there's even some plastic parts on the turbine part of the compressor part of the turbocharger. Engine mounting. Okay, we talked about the bolts running in through the corners and in the center on the bottom, and then two in the middle up here that go through the firewall and use the cables for additional strength because of the close mounting to the firewall and the lack of triangulation in the engine mount. Now, as far as mounting to the engine, you would use your engine mounting package, which is two rubber isolators, cone shaped for each location, a steel tube that runs inside those, and large AN washers, one on each side. Make sure they don't touch the engine in any way. As you can see on this one, we actually had to do a little bit of grinding on this prototype, which is not the case on production models. Because if you don't want this washer to touch the engine, you'll just be transmitting vibration right back into the engine. So there's a little AN6 washer and a large AN fender washer, and the same on the other side. You do that on all four corners as far as where the rubber dampers are installed. as far as getting air into the oil, into the intercooler, on our Super Duty, we built a box on this, and we ran a duct up to the inlet side of the cowling. That's one way you can do this. We'll show video of that. Another way is on this installation, we're using a aluminum piece that we have a template for. It incorporates a piano hinge here. Also incorporates another piano hinge on the back corner of the intercooler. And we'll show how to put that together. All right, so here you can see the baffle. You can just swing this out of the way if you want to work on the airplane, or you just pull the pin and it comes off in a second. But basically, and then we added another bulb to the duct here, so that when this closes, it hits the bulb. Obviously, you don't want to wear into the aluminum. So then we take a look at the top and just see that on the inside, well, we're going to put the cowling on, we can see how it all works, but basically on the back side here, the shroud then is not touching the engine, and it kind of gives just like this area for the intercooler air to get. And on the back side, it just kind of like make sure it doesn't touch the throttle. It bumps down there, so it's not really touching anything. And now let's just put the cowling on, and we can see what that looks like with the cowling. Okay, so this shows it with the bottom cowling on. So what you've got is a cowling, and it's somewhat open underneath. That gets all the turbocharger air and everything easily out of the engine compartment. And then we got your radiator, which then is underneath, as you see the plane from the front. You need a lot of cooling for that kind of power with a slow airplane. And being kind of an off-road airplane, we're not too concerned about if it's not 100% covered or anything like that. That being said, someone wanted to, yeah, sure. You don't have to cut the opening this big underneath if you don't want to. But for us, we just thought it was an easy thing to do. It's easy to get the cowling on and off. Basically, the cowling just drops straight down. So it makes it easy, okay? Then it has some quarter-turn fasteners in the original locations provided by Just on their airframe. Now, let's take a look at the dam for the intercooler. So the air will then enter here. There'll be a top cowling, of course, and then it enters the side, and it goes then in this trough and right into the intercooler. And then little plates can be made on the bottom and top too, either fiberglass to the cowling or riveted to the this aluminum baffle to close air from escaping top and bottom. So now let's put the top cowling on. Well, before we do, let's talk a little bit about the engine from above here. We mentioned the gearbox and the probe there. There's your high pressure fuel pump that makes the direct injected system possible. Here's the fuel line coming in from the header tank behind the seats in the airplane, and I'll show you that. It has a quick disconnect right there and a Radiator clamp to make it secure. Let's go and look at the rest of the fuel. Well, let's talk about a few more things. These are the coils. You'll find the spark plugs underneath these coils. There is a video showing how to do a compression check on the engine for the annual inspection on YouTube. And that's pretty much all there's up there. And as far as the fuel system, let's take a quick look since we're talking about it. You'll find a lot of videos on YouTube about the Viking header tanks like these with the pumps built into the tank. So that's basically your entire fuel system. You're just going to gravity feed from the wing tanks through fuel lines into the top, and then the bottom will have the pumps, and then your fuel hose and your drain. Your drain will go to the bottom of the airplane right here. You have a high pressure fuel filter there, and then it goes right to the engine from there. No more fittings, no fuel valves. As you can see, we've been working on the Super Stol with the Viking 180 for a while. Here's a little flashback showing over 800 pounds of thrust during the testing of the initial layout of this configuration. Now, as you can see, the power is just being increased and the thrust is increasing. And as we apply the boost to the turbocharged engine, we're getting over 800 pounds of thrust. Alright, these were the early days of the Super Stol development. Let's listen a little bit to the smoothness of this engine.
It has the 5-bladed propeller on it. It's an extremely smooth running engine.
Alright, so as you can see, this was the beginning. It's a big 5-bladed propeller, and we're starting to flight test it in 2017. Flew it up to Oshkosh and back. And then, as you can see, the engine mount is much further forward on this than it was on the final model that we're doing right now.